It's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening. I'd like to say a few words of introduction, a very few words of introduction, because undoubtedly you're all quite tired. We've had a very exhausting and fulfilling conference to this point. In putting together this one and only keynote panel for this symposium, the program committee was interested in raising some of the significant issues in bringing contemplative practices, especially those that fall under the general rubric of mindfulness, from academic settings and practice centers out into the larger social and political context in which we are all embedded. In doing so, we were concerned with the ever-growing phenomenon of what some have called McMindfulness, the popular cultural notion that mindfulness, whatever that is, it's kind of a more respectable word than meditation, has a wide range of exclusively positive outcomes when applied to an incredibly wide range of problems related to human health and well-being. So in order to begin to address this issue of the use and abuse and overuse of mindfulness, we have put together this panel this evening. So I would like to, in order, introduce them to you. First, Carolyn Jacobs, who is the Emerita Dean of Social Work at Smith College. Second, we have Jeremy Hunter, who is a professor at the Drucker School of Business at Claremont College. Third, we have the woman who needs no introduction, Sharon Salzberg. Fourth, we have my partner in crime, Amishi, professor at University of Miami, Cognitive Science. And finally, our new Mind and Life President, Susan Bauer-Wu.
Good evening. Okay. I am an African American woman. I come from a culture that is about relationship. There is a sense that in a relationship of a connection with audience and presenters. So one of the things that happens, and I did this for 14 years as dean, is when I say good evening, you say good evening. Thank you. We are facing an extraordinary time of possibility and opportunity, of fear, concern, but extraordinary hope, because we are a people of hope. We have spent time in contemplative practice, we've spent time in education, we've spent time looking critically at issues of research and the mind and relationships. And we cannot afford the luxury of being stunned for too long. We cannot afford the luxury of not knowing what to do. We cannot afford the luxury of having the people who are very poor, vulnerable, of color, who will suffer from homophobic acts and other acts in this society, sit back, hide in the community, and wonder where we are. And so if we talk about the promises and the pitfalls of mindfulness and the sense of the commercialization, however you may see that, of mindfulness, it is incumbent upon us to do the kind of research that looks at the best set of skills and understanding and practices that can be of the most help to people in the community as we move forward in affecting the change that is going to transform their lives once again. I say this because I come out of a long history of a people of African descent who have faced what it meant to be enslaved in this country, to go through the kind of challenges and opportunities that were opened up for civil rights, and to stay in the streets and to stay in support of children and the next generation. I stand on the shoulders of many of them. I had to face this week when I've been into my, I've turned 70 and I should be retired more fully than I am. What can I do? I've done all the work that I need to do professionally, and I should serve on a few boards and travel a lot. Well, I face the reality that I can't afford that luxury. I have an obligation and a responsibility, just as we all do. Your ancestors may have come from very different parts of this world, yet they came as immigrants, as people struggling to find a better life and a way for their children. We have a responsibility to honor our ancestors. You stand on their shoulders just as I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors. And in order to go forward with this, we must bring the best of our mind, heart, spirit, and hands together to move into action. Contemplation without action is dead. Research that sits, even if it sits in the cloud, is not accessible. It has to be available to people in the most sound way. So my challenge to you is also the promise to you. It's the promise of what we can do. We are a people who have overcome many things. It is now time to stop sitting back waiting for somebody else to do something, to look around and see what we do in our respective communities, and to look around and see what we do collectively in this nation to take it back for the people who are all citizens. And so I reflect on a quote from Toni Morrison, because one of the things that's happened to me this week is I've gotten emails from friends talking about, the gloom and doom, but also looking at poets and writers for signs of hope. And part of my reflection from something that was sent to me by her is, this is precisely the time each one of us must go to work. There's no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We must speak, we must write, we must do research, and we must practice. Our work must be focused on serving others, especially the most vulnerable, on serving our fragile earth. This environment is as much at risk as every poor child in this country, and of serving this earth in preparation for the next generation. For this is how we will heal and create the actions which will flow out of our contemplative practice, how we will use the abundant gifts for which we are stewards is our moral responsibility. These gifts are entrusted to us from our ancestors, developed with support and guidance from our mentors, teachers, family, friends, from our Sangha, from our communities. We are invited to this time in our country and our world to be loving, faithful stewards of the gifts of our mind, our heart, and our hands. The promise of mainstreaming mindfulness, of contemplative practices for ourselves and our world, can only be fulfilled if we attend to the call for deeper practice, more rigorous research that is in context that is inclusive, and to loving action. So this evening's discussion focuses on that which we're called to do in the care of one another and our world as we explore promises and perils of mainstreaming mindfulness. Our format is such that there will be 4 topics that we have worked on as a panel under the context of the program description. Each topic will be discussed for 10 minutes with one of the panelists taking the lead and others responding. I'll keep us moving through the topics because we have 4 topics, 10 minutes, and we want to have time for questions from the audience, and I am too old to be here at midnight. So, Amishi will give the final reflection, and Sharon will do a guide of closing practice for us. And so, let us begin. So in the first topic is to Jeremy, being in the now, why now? What factors have given rise to mindfulness having its cultural moment now?
Yeah, that's what a question, right? Some are totally obvious, the answers. So I thought I would focus on maybe some that are less obvious. One, I think, is, let me give you a very nerdy answer, but it's the decline in productivity in the Western nations. And as productivity has gone down in the last 40 years, right, that means the margin you have to live off is less. And so the stress we experience is more. Peter Drucker thought that the critics of mindfulness will often point to the dirty word of productivity as kind of this unholy, dirty thing that we apply these precious skills to which I'd like to respond that it's the productivity of the Western economies that allow people to have the margin in their lives to have a spiritual life. So for me, productivity and spirituality are intimately intertwined, right? Because you can have the space to take off time from work and think about things other than just your normal, your surviving. So that's one huge challenge. And Drucker thought that, that the productivity of knowledge workers, the productivity of those of us who use our minds to make a living was the greatest of the 21st century management challenges. That how do you sustain quality of life? It's how you sustain quality of life, basically. So that's one thing. The other is growing psychological sophistication around the world. I was talking with a good friend of mine who does leadership work in Great Britain, and he said, 60 years ago, people wouldn't be interested in this kind of thing. What did Winston Churchill basically woke up drunk and drank his way through the day. And I think that, how did he deal with the pain and stress of the world? And I think that for many people, right, it's alcohol or some kind of pain-deadening device or domestic violence or something. And at some point, some shift happened where people realized that they have to look inside themselves as well, that's not really a solution. Dealing with your pain is not really, in that sort of way, is not a solution. So I think as a people, at least in the Europe and North America and the so-called developed countries, I think that growing sense of importance of one's inner life is now not taken for granted, or is taken for granted as something important to do. And then, all the usual suspects. We're on a planet that is really in a lot of trouble. And how do you retool an economy on a planet of 7 billion people so that we can all live on it I've stopped using the word sustainable because a colleague of mine said, that's not really that exciting because you would never describe your marriage as sustainable. But, how do you, and at Case Western Reserve, there's a very interesting group of people talking about how to think about retooling for a green economy that actually makes our lives better than the one now, which I thought is a much more evocative framework. We assume this is good, but how could we have it better, right? I think those are 3 that come to mind. Right? And then the weaknesses of the Western materialist paradigm are all kind of on for show, whether it's in medicine and education, all of that. One other thing, 30 years ago, the former president, Derek Bach of Harvard, did a study on like trust in American institutions, right? And then around the world, that trust in institutions was declining. And at that time that I was at the Kennedy School, the only institutions people trusted was like the post office and the military. And then in the meantime, somebody went postal, and so we don't trust them anymore. And then I'm not sure what the standing of the military is, but basically our confidence in our institutions to perform, which is one of Peter Drucker's core theories of how do you maintain a free world, is that you have institutions that perform, is also on the decline. And so why wouldn't we want to be interested in mindfulness? I personally think that it should be a liberal art. That in the 21st century, learning how to manage your mind and understanding your mind and seeing how how you use your mind translates into action and the results those actions produce should be a liberal art everybody knows, right? In addition to reading and writing and philosophy and history and all of that, in a world that is quickly changing, learning how to see your mind and adapt is something I think we all need to know how to do.
Would anyone else like to comment on this topic?
I can say a few things. So I think in addition to the comments that you made, another intersecting point to consider is the role that recent discoveries in neuroscience may play. And I'm not talking about just this notion of neuroplasticity. I mean, that we've known, the brain can reorganize. We've mostly focused for the history of the field of neuroscience on reorganization in the face of stroke or brain damage of some sort. But, when I was in graduate school, the idea that the human brain could actually grow new neurons, birth new neurons, was not known. And it was during, all through undergrad, we learned, you're kind of born, you have many more neurons as you develop, they prune, then you're an adult, and then it's just this downward decline till you got very few left and not a lot of functioning. And it was pretty remarkable when we learned, oh yeah, adults can also create new neurons, and of course there is this reorganization that we know that happens. So somehow I think that knowledge has infused the public interest and public hope that maybe it's the case that just like the body can be trained to be more physically fit through exercise, there may be a way in which the mind can be trained to be healthier. And I see our effort as a community, as all of us, as a way to help bring about an understanding of what that actual route may be. What is the training? What is the way in which we should exercise the mind? Because we're not at a point where our public health officials can give us guidance. We can say, okay, with regard to physical exercise, you should try to get, 10 to 20 minutes, more like 30 minutes a day, 5 to 7 days a week, raise your heart rate. I mean, that's a pretty precise formula. They're not saying you must train for a marathon or you must go and weight lift for 4 hours a day, right? They're giving us precise guidance that is also in flux. And I think that there's a parallel there with what we should be thinking about with regard to the role that contemplative science, contemplative neuroscience can play in guiding.
Thank you. Could we move on then, Sharon, to Mac mindfulness and right mindfulness?
The phrase McMindfulness is so cute. And I mean, really, it's pretty cute. I don't tend to think in those terms very much. Both, I have seen just enormous wave of interest. I came back from India as a meditation teacher in 1974. And certainly the idea of meditation or the word mindfulness was unknown. I mean, you never used it. And to describe oneself as a meditation teacher was intimations of like the really esoteric and weird. And so for me, it really has felt like witnessing a revolution to the good. That the ways people can access these methods and these techniques is extraordinary for me to see. As I said in an earlier program here, my first teacher was S.N. Goenka, and I began meditating in the context of an intensive 10-day retreat in January of 1971, so that was a long time ago. And the first night of my first retreat, so this is really my entree into this world, Goenka said, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism, the Buddha taught a way of life. So these were practically the first words that I heard, and they formed a foundation for my understanding all along. So as I said in this other panel, I'm sometimes very amused when asked what I think about secular mindfulness, because in my mind, mindfulness has always been secular, which doesn't mean there aren't experiences of the sacred or the transcendent, but its very core has been openness and availability, not tied to a belief system, not about assuming an identity, not about becoming something or rejecting anything else. It's methodologies of awareness and available to everybody. There are concerns, of course, and I also would like to say that I don't feel myself responsible for policing history. I don't want to decide who's like too Mick, in the mindfulness teaching. And I'm concerned with my own integrity and the integrity of my work and where I fall in various possibilities. There are clearly concerns. One of the things I talk about a lot is how so much of what is spoken about with mindfulness these days is really about enjoying your life. It's about inhabiting your life, which is fabulous. And so we talk about multitasking, for example. If you're drinking a cup of tea while you're checking your email, while you're on a conference call, while you have the TV on mute and you're reading the crawl, it's not going to be a very satisfying cup of tea. And we so rarely look at the quality of our awareness as having a role in our dissatisfaction. So then we're in an addictive spiral. I need better tea. I need a tea ball. I need to use loose tea, right? And so we keep going. And so it's tremendous to offer people the possibility of actually living their lives more fully. But classically, mindfulness is certainly not only meant to be about inhabiting your life, it's about understanding your life. It's about wisdom. It's about really being able to discern for oneself what causes suffering. We're taught so many things and fed so many myths. Is vengefulness, for example, really that strong? Is compassion really that weak? What have we been taught, but what is our direct experience? And so that's of great concern to me, that the wisdom element is not nearly as emphasized as, enjoying things. And certainly the whole compassion, loving kindness aspect is sometimes left aside. And of tremendous concern, which I've also talked about here for me, is just the qualifications of who's teaching. Because in the end, I admire so many of the people who are taking these tools and they're working in such a wide variety of places, from business to prisons to schools, and it's great. But I get very concerned about people who feel that they're done. They're kind of done learning in a way, and I'm much happier about people who, whatever training they may have gotten, form kind of communities of mutual support and networks where together we feel that we're always learning and there's always more to know, and so we can sort of do that together.
Any response from another or comment from anyone else on the panel?
Susan.
Well, I think that the qualification of teachers is really, that's the bottleneck, right? That's the bottleneck that can sink this whole thing. And there's a really fantastic book called American Veda by Philip Goldberg, who lives in LA, which is a history of Vedic thought on American culture. And there's a chapter on it about TM, obviously. And there's some very interesting, almost step-by-step parallels in the TM, in the explosion of the TM movement in the 70s and mindfulness. The good news is mindfulness is a much more robust phenomena because it's not centered around one organization and one university or whatnot. But what sunk it was this sudden explosion of interest and then explosion of training teachers, and then of course somebody has some picadillo, and then kabam, it all falls apart. And that's, I think, the big challenge that we have. And so with all the different critiques of the whole mindfulness thing, it's nice to have, it's good to have critics. It's even better to have informed critics that can actually be helpful. And one of the challenges, I think, going forward is the training of teachers. And once, if you've quote unquote had your secular mindfulness practice, what happens in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years when these people start to have awakening experiences and don't know what to do with them, right? That's coming down the road, but I don't think that's with us yet. But that's a real issue, right? So I think they're the imagined issues that get thought up in the faculty club, and then they're the real issues, right? And those two, I think, are the pertinent real issues.
Just so, yeah, mindfulness as it's being disseminated is secular, and so perfectly okay. It's really good because, I think what motivates us, and it relates to the first question, there's the very simple answer, there's a lot of suffering. And this is one way to help alleviate some of the suffering that's all around us. But the idea of ethics, so where does that play into the broader movement? So I think just to hold that, and we can come back and touch upon it. But what are the intentions that are behind this becoming so popular and people taking it on? And if we maintain the intention of alleviating individual, societal, and planetary suffering, then I'd like to kind of hold that and keep the light on that as we are continuing to spread this.
Amishi, we started out with why now? And the topic for you is, but science says so.
So one thing I just wanted to say is, we're obviously doing a kind of a round-robin snapshot of a lot of things. A lot of it's to prime the pump in your own minds, which I can feel it in the room. It's like, but what about this and that? Thought bubbles are popping up in heads. I see them from the stage. So just know that this is why we want to spend a lot of time talking after we kind of lay out some of the main themes that we're seeing as issues with regard to this topic of mainstreaming mindfulness. Is that okay with everybody? Thought bubbles happening? Okay. So in terms of science, I thought it would be helpful maybe to just similar to what Sharon was saying, come from where I'm at and really checking in with my background and my intentions and my role in this work. And I guess, for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet yet or haven't come across any of the work that we've been doing, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. So the work in my lab is interested specifically in the brain's attention system, how it is that it functions, how it's organized, and we use a variety of techniques, cognitive neuroscience techniques, brain imaging, EEG recordings, and behavioral tasks. And my work pivoted toward kind of a different way of exploring this topic. It wasn't so much only around how it works, but what happens when the whole functioning of this very important brain system shifts, when it is degraded, and what are the ways in which it becomes vulnerable? Things like threat, fear, stress, poor mood. And if that's the case, if we see that we can kind of characterize when it is that attention starts falling apart, how might we be able to help? Are there training tools that we can offer to help bolster it? And that's where the mindfulness training came into the work in my own lab. So just that's where I'm coming from. And you know, a lot of times when I and it relates to the question of science, and in some sense, because of my background in the work that I do, even though it's of course siloed, like a lot of scientists, all of us scientists, I mean, we know a lot about very, very, very little, very little. I'm asked to, in some sense, represent what's going on in this field. And I've been asked by many leaders in communities that I'm interested in working with because the nature of what they do, they face threat, poor mood, high demand, high stress, which makes them vulnerable to degrading their attention to the point at which what they used to be able to do well, they may not do so well under the circumstances. And that's quite problematic because that's when they need their attention the most. So these are high stress groups. These are students. These are military service members and military spouses. These are athletes, corporate people in the business context. We worked with a group of accountants before tax season because they knew that was going to be their high stress interval. So, and when I do this, when I'm able to connect with and partner with these types of groups, I have to speak to the leadership about, please take in our grant-funded research project, right? So they ask a pretty straightforward question when I approach them, which is, okay, nice to meet you. Does this thing work? Like, what you want me to spend a minute of time with my community, my employees, or my people I'm charged with supporting, does this thing work? And I think it's a pretty fair question. And those of you that are working in applied settings, I'm sure have come across this of, is it worthwhile to even begin attempting to work in this context? And I could just fast track it and say, yeah, of course it works. When can I set up my protocol, to work with you? But I think it's a really important question. And I think that we have a responsibility to probe this question ourselves, because that's where the science has an interface with the question, right? So first of all, what do we mean by it? Does it work? It is a pretty broad thing in and of itself. We can now have people download an app, read a book, go to a YouTube channel, take an MBSR class, an MBCT class, go on retreat. There's a world of options. So even when somebody asks if it works, I have to begin by saying, well, there's many things you could do, so we need to know what we're talking about. And then the question is, what does it mean to work? And from my point of view, it really is around, going back to Susan's point regarding intention, is what we're offering going to help reduce suffering? And that suffering can come in many forms. It can be suffering in the body, right? Different physical ailments. It can be suffering in the mind with psychological disorders, and suffering in relationships. And what I've seen come about through our field of contemplative science and contemplative neuroscience is that the work we're doing kind of falls under one of those three areas, where we're looking to see the impact of our mindfulness training program, for example, and its impact on physical symptoms or psychological symptoms or the nature of relationships. And I think the news is starting to be quite good, right? We've got meta-analyses now. I mean, we've seen this meteoric rise in the number of publications. We're now probably at about between 5,000 and 10,000. I think maybe that's an estimate. And we're at the point where we can now call the literature and actually say, okay, yeah, look, there's something going on here. If we look at a meta-analysis with 115 papers, looking at randomized controlled designs, it looks to be the case that there are some things that are better because people take a mindfulness-based stress reduction course or an MBCT course relative to doing something else or a waitlist group. Same thing with the brain data. We now can do meta-analyses of brain imaging, structural data, functional data, and that also looks quite promising. And so that's the good stuff. At that point you might say, yeah, look, it's good. But my job as a scientist, first and foremost, is not to just be a cheerleader for an enterprise, but to really help all of us, including the communities I'm interfacing with and the leadership I'm trying to convince to take me in as their project, to be responsible consumers of information. So that they're not just, it's part of the nature of how we want to function as a society. We want smart people making good choices. And so when I even say these things of what we know, I'm also careful to say, and look, there are other concerns that are emerging. And many of you know about the whole positivity bias problem with mindfulness research, where there's a disproportionate number of studies that are suggesting benefits relative to typically seen in any new treatment context. So we have to go really think about that, right? So any comment to the question, any answer to the question, does it work, shouldn't just be yes, but a really highly provisional yes. And there's a lot more work to be done, and I encourage you all, since I have my 2 minutes to speak right now, to say, if you have data that has null results, no effects, or negative effects, please publish it. It will help us all. Because again, this is not about some confirmation of what we already know. The Dharma is the truth, and we're just out to just make sure that we're endorsing it with our work. We are, and as a scientist, I'll say I'm a scientist first and foremost, and my job is to figure out what's going on, what the nature of the truth of the way the world works is. So that's where I'm at with regard to science. I think that we have come far. There's a lot of good work we're doing, and I think this conference gives me so much hope of the level of rigor increasing in our collective efforts, in the dialogue and the elevation of the conversation we're having with regard to specificity of mechanisms. And there's continued work to be done. So I've probably spoken for way too long, but those are my thoughts.
But very good. How about a way forward, Susan?
A single way forward.
Well, I'm just reading the prompt.
Well, we have a mixed group here. So we have a variety of scientists and scholars, and we have people bringing these practices into the real world, and we have leaders. Jeremy, your session today, everyone's raving about. And so it's a mixed group. And I think we all need to be continuing to communicate and be working together. And specifically, as I think about the researchers that are coming up with these great ideas in the lab, the academic setting, and you just kind of, brainstorming all together, but the best research ideas are coming from the real world, right? And it's not only getting great results, and we can have these fabulous results, but if we have these results, we want to be able to disseminate them. So they have to be meaningful results that are cost effective in a way where they can reach people to ultimately reduce suffering. So with that, I really am hoping that we can have more opportunities for people who are in positions of influence, leaders, policymakers, to be spending time with the people who are actually doing the research. I think there needs to be that kind of cross-collaboration, and there's not a lot of that happening, and I would just put that forward, that is a great aspiration that I have. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to actually ask Amishi to share her experience speaking to the Pentagon, because that, to me, is like the ultimate in policymakers, and the translation of your really incredible research. So if you could share.
Yeah. Once we were kind of talking a little bit before, Susan said, we want to connect with the policymakers and we want to be able to interface. And I'm like, be careful what you wish for in many ways, because I think that, I've been very fortunate to be able to share this work with people that I would say have the ability to do a lot of good. And the intention behind why they're asking to speak to me is, I think, in the service of helping their own communities. So for the past 6 months, I've had the opportunity to speak to federal judges, obviously, some corporate leaders, and then, most recently at the Pentagon. And the interesting thing about the Pentagon presentations or time there was that it was done, my co-presenter was a 2-star general who actually, at the time I began my work in the military context, was the colonel that said, yes, come work with us. And what's very interesting now is, and not just now, but that kind of launched the whole work, is that there is a big need. There's been what now, 15 years of continuous conflict that our military service members have been engaged in, and there is a big need for them to help with the amount of challenge that they face. That's on the one hand. So, with regard to psychological treatments and assistance and resilience for them is important, and I think a lot of good work is happening. There were a few presentations today and at this meeting regarding PTSD and veterans and that kind of work. And on the other hand, if you're going to send a group, just as I was talking about earlier, if you're going to send a group of people who have been under a protracted period of high stress into a war zone where each individual person has a weapon that could destroy an entire village, wouldn't you want them to have all of their attentional capacity so that they're not responding in a reactive way? And what was really striking in my conversation with the general is that he said, we train people to be ready to look for certain things and then respond. But sometimes that training can harm them because they're not actually observing what's in front of them. They're not actually discerning what's happening. And that prevents them from acting with awareness. And the cost to those people themselves, of course there's devastation that they could inflict, but the cost to themselves is lifelong then, when they themselves make errors. So his reason for supporting our work and for partnering with us was really in the service of helping not only on the psychological health side, but also to minimize the amount of reactivity and errors that could be made. Because, we were talking about earlier with regard to ethical code, one thing we know is that regardless of the ethical code that's presented to any of us, if we are in a depleted, exhausted, overly stressed, threatened state, that code is not present in our mind in that moment. We are not able to consciously have the cognitive capacity to hold it so that it guides our action. So part of what we're doing with regard to the Pentagon itself has been to talk about a way forward. If we're finding that it's beneficial, how can we now scale up training? Who are the right kind of trainers we should partner with? What should the training look like? What should be its components? And the components themselves have not only the mindfulness aspects that are similar to mindfulness-based stress reduction, but they have connection and kindness as aspects that we want to put in. Because as he says, this General Walter Pyatt, compassion is more powerful than bullets. And he said that at the Pentagon. He said, in no uncertain terms, that this is not about some soft, weak thing. This is the way we need to be. If we're the ones charged with this kind of behavior and this kind of engagement, we need to have compassion at the front of our minds in anything that we do. So that's some of what I've been up to.
Thank you.
At this point, it's an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Since Amishi was able to see you bubbling up out there, I think there are some mics someplace. I don't see them. Are there mics someplace?
Or you could just ask them telepathically.
Okay. Here they come. Okay. So please, I would invite you to be focused on one question and feel free to direct it to any of the panelists or to put it in the air and the panelists will respond. Yes.
So I'd like to pick up on, Susan, your comment, because what I've been concerned about with the mindfulness revolution is that it has kind of dropped off the ethics side. And on the one hand, that concerns me because Mathieu Ricard said we could be making more mindful killers. And on the other, I'm not sure I should be concerned because, of course, if you travel this path, the ethics start to come along with it in my experience. So I guess I'm interested either in yours or one of the other panelists' thoughts about how concerned should we be about mindfulness separated from ethics?
I think the context with the way it's taught, the intention behind the person who's teaching it, and I also think, I'm going out on a limb here to say it, but I also think that to look at the intention behind why it's being delivered. Meaning, is it to just create a product that's going to potentially make a lot of money without, do you want to add, you know where I'm going with this?
Sure. that was just funny. I think in terms of the history of Buddhist teaching, as far as I know, there have always been different strands in terms of this question. My own training was very much that you start with a basis of ethics, because that is like, first of all, it does two things. One is it includes your awareness of the rest of your life, not just an activity that you may be doing every day for 10 minutes a day, but really bringing up the questions of like, how do you speak to your neighbors? How do you speak to your children? So that it's really a glimpse into the fact that this is a seamless activity in terms of everything. And then it also, in many schools, ethics are taught first because it's along the lines of giving yourself a break. Like, instead of sitting down to meditate and trying to have some concentration and tranquility when your mind is like tortured by, all the lies you still need to tell to bolster the original lies that you already just told. And, it's such a hard way to go about things. And so that is very much the way I was taught, the way I was trained. There have also been schools that are kind of along the lines of the implication of part of the comment with the question, that these things will come. We pay attention, we see so much more clearly what it feels like when we're generous, what it feels like when we're frightened to give, and it's on the basis of that clear seeing that we turn around our lives. So I have a slightly different concern than that because of that variety, in which I think it's reflected, Susan, in what you said about intention or the basic context, whether you call it suffering or you call it stress. I think that's at the core of a kind of right motivation in a way. You want to turn your life around so that you're happier. And the answers of how to do that may surprise you, which is good. But I think there's the possibility of eliminating that. And that's when it really becomes a commodity. I was watching a whole other conference with a whole other organization once online. And somebody who I believe was extremely well motivated and was trying to find a way to express, the benefits he had gotten from his practice and a way to have it much more widespread. And the way he put it, I know some of you were there, you're on my little computer screen, was, you've got to get rid of that suffering thing, it's the wrong brand. And I practically passed out in my living room, and it went on to say, basically, you have to sell it in terms of achievement and money and success. Get rid of that suffering thing, because that'll turn people off. So then I thought, oh, that's too far for me. Although I honestly believe he was perfectly well motivated. Then I think you've lost something really, it's irreparable in a way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, could we? Yes.
I understand from what I've heard that when we use the word mind, in English, that we're usually thinking about the brain. And it strikes me that, in a way, the name Mind Life and even our symbolology is all geared towards brain instead of the mind-heart, which I think is what the Pali word is. And so that was a statement in form of a question. My concern coming here is that I see this preponderance of founder effect looking at brain issues in the protocol designs rather than heart issues. And I wonder if we shouldn't, or the people who are leading, shouldn't be steering towards more, we'll say, loving kindness oriented studies of neurobiology, if you will.
Thank you. May I respond?
Yeah.
Please.
Anybody can.
Were you here at the opening? So I absolutely agree with you. And I think that the field is transitioning, and we are playing an active role in our new vision of going from pure awareness-based practices, but awareness-based practices to heart-opening practices to action-based practices. And that's where we are, and I completely agree with you. And as a teacher of these practices for quite a long time myself, is the foundation of teaching mindfulness is very much heartfulness. And I think when we come back to that is, it's, we know, in, Eastern traditions, there's no distinction between heart and mind, and Kokoro. So thank you.
I want to make a comment too.
Yeah.
Which is, I understand what you're saying about the founder effect and all that stuff, but what I want to say is, if you think that there's research that should be done and projects that should be done, do them. Just do them, because I started my comment by saying, this is what I do. This is the toolkit I have. This is the work that I've done. And I think a lot of those of us that have been working in this area, that's all we can bring to it. So please, if there are other tools, other directions, other broadening that you want to see happen, for those of you that were clapping, nobody is stopping you.
And we're funding them now.
What?
And
there's funding now. So just, I will tell you that when I started working in this area, NIH wasn't calling me up and saying, Amishi, please change your research trajectory to have mindfulness. Nobody was inviting me to do this kind of work. It happened because I felt a need to move my research program in a direction that was more meaningful for my personal interests. And thankfully, I was able to figure out a way to make it happen. And a lot of our stories for the people that have been doing that are in that direction. So I want to ask you to just take the reins of your own interests and go for it. So.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to the first comments that were made. And is it established that productivity has declined, or has productivity increased to the point there isn't enough work of meaning to go around?
Yeah, there's a really good TED talk on this. I can't remember. It's 9:30 or it's 9 o'clock, and I can't remember my name. But if you, it's fairly well established since the 1970s. In the Western world, at least in the industrialized world, productivity is dropping. And so just Google it, like TED Talk productivity, and I forget, and the guy's name, he's French. So if the French guy, TED Talk productivity, maybe it'll show up. But yeah.
And if I could make one statement from my perspective, is that mindfulness is an example of a necessary but not a sufficient condition.
Agreed.
So maybe for those of the audience that wasn't at your talk earlier, you should also disclose that you have a 1-year-old.
Oh yeah, I have a little baby.
And you haven't slept in a
Who's
year?
here also. So we haven't slept in a year and 3 months. So I'm impressed that I can even speak English at this point. So yeah,
Not just a year, but a year and 3 months.
A year and 3 months.
Yes.
because the last trimester was tough for both of us.
The next question, please.
Thank you. So I've been struggling with this, and I'd like the panel to address it. When you narrow a space with hard boundaries so that you can limit the variables that can be measured quantitatively, are you really representing the real-world system, or are you modeling it, or is it a smaller scale that then we can go back and apply in the real world?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay.
There were more nouns in that than I could.
Jeremy. Okay. So we'll talk our language, Jeremy. So typically in research, in order to measure something, because you got to measure and represent, you put some boundaries of that space so that and variables that can be measured quantitatively. When you do that, are you really representing the real world, or are you creating a smaller version of it that doesn't represent all the variables?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you take that learning back to validate something that was probably not done
So-
quantitatively?
Yeah, no, to answer your question a little more, sorry, didn't mean to be flippant, but it is really, the answer really is yes to that comment from my point of view. I think that, you start from the point of view that you're not going to be able to capture full complexity of anything that you're examining. That's for sure. So for example, in the work that we've been doing with regard to mindfulness training in applied settings, we're asking questions about really practical considerations for best implementation. What's the right dosing, meaning what's the right amount of time we should take that's allowable in the context we're working with, and still we see benefits? And when do we fail to see benefits? Maybe that they want us to do this all in a 2-hour afternoon workshop, but when we actually look to see if there's attentional changes, there aren't any. And if we give 8 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is, we start seeing changes. So, but no, or there's questions regarding what are the active ingredients? What are the critical components of a mindfulness training program? Should you have didactic information about how great this program is going to be and how bad stress is for you, or should you just spend your time practicing together? Or what's the best delivery structure? Should you have if you've got 8 hours, should you spread it out across 8 weeks, or should you do it in one day? So these are practical considerations, and the answers may be extremely variable depending on what aspects of the person or the community or the group that you're looking at. And we have to select a subset that are important to the questions that we're asking, and then we probe those across many different manipulations. So, I think that we have to accept that in any time we are engaged in research, that we're going to fail to capture the full complexity, but we're going to do our best in identifying the critical variables so that we're able to see if those are moving with the manipulations we investigate.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to have different kinds of research too. As interesting and totally fascinating as neuroscience is, it's also interesting and totally fascinating to read qualitative report.
Absolutely.
And stories, and how did this affect this person's life, and how did they deal with the difficulties in a way that's different as well, and then how do you start to thread through the fact that this part of your brain lights up to the fact that in action when the baby is crying, what are you doing, right? So, that's an interesting, there's a lot to be done.
Case studies are wonderful.
Right. Not that I have any experience with it.
No.
Thank you.
First person report, please.
Thank you. So as I was walking up here, my thought bubble popped and all the words spilled out. So I don't know that I have the formulation of a real question. But I was thinking about the term secular, and I was wondering if that's maybe code word that might mean individualized. That if it's not secular, I might have to align myself with a group or a community, and that in the context of mindfulness as an individual practice versus a unimind kind of. That's a reference to Toy Story. Thank you.
It might. I'm very awake, so I don't have that problem. My day is just starting.
It's going to be a long night.
It's going to be a long night. You want to stay up?
Okay. Sounds fun.
That's how I started this conference. Those of you who were not here. I think it might be. I think really it's pretty specifically used because as these techniques have reached us by and large, and certainly originally, like in the 70s, 60s, 70s, they were coming from the context of Buddhist traditions rather than other traditions, although that wouldn't necessarily be the case. It just historically is how it happened. And so to distinguish the even ardent immersion into these methods and techniques from becoming a Buddhist or calling yourself a Buddhist is really how I think the term has gotten popularized.
Yes.
Hi. I also start my second day usually at that time, so I have the whole night with you, Sharon.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's a question or reflection, but listening to you, and I understand you were talking about mindfulness mostly, and to you, the panel, as inherited from different Buddhist traditions, but you know, coming from a peace-building background and having traveled the world in situations of violence, what struck me is that, so we talk about revolution of mindfulness, but what about in this country among communities who are oppressed and around the world, what I've witnessed the past 30 years, that people, for them it was natural. You know, what we struggle to recreate or to refine was part of their innate life, and they have been taken away from that by structural violence and very brutal direct violence. You know, all the genocide and massive violence cases in which I've been, there is a very cultural dimension to it, to being taken away and your soul being ripped apart. So what are we going to do to reach out to those communities and to those communities in this country who have historically had their own practices of contemplation and mindfulness and may have been completely taken away from that, because for them it's not rediscovering, it's not, the revolution is reverse almost, and yet it's still there. You know, we can still help harness those resources and help build that together. So I'm not sure it's a question, but that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I support an organization called the Trauma Resource Institute, which is in Claremont. And they, the founders developed these trauma healing methods first for first responders, because we had these massive fires in Southern California, and taught them to firefighters. And then once the firefighters the fires were out, then people went back to their usually county jobs and started using the same trauma healing methods in their work, working with youth who were in difficult spots and at-risk communities and all this sort of stuff. And they found that the same biologically based models work for them too. And then a research project came, and then years after that, they developed what they called the community resiliency model, which you would teach to people like ministers and counselors, so they could inject this knowledge into the community, and that they teach one another. And because it's biologically based, you can, everybody's vagus nerve works the same way, more or less, right? So you could spread it easily within a community and also globally, because you could talk about it in terms of nervous system. And so it's a really wonderful organization, and I highly recommend. They're using it in San Bernardino, which is a really hard-scrabble place in Southern California, and especially with gang violence and a lot of that. And their stories that they have are really quite remarkable. So Trauma Resource Institute, if you're interested in checking it out, it's really fantastic work.
Thank you. Next question.
This goes to Jeremy's question about what happens when people have awakening experiences. That's you, by the way, but I invite anybody to answer. This goes to a concern of mine of a comprehensive path of view, meditation, and action. So it seems like we're starting with meditation and expecting action, and the view might be missing. So I see some nods. Please respond.
Yeah, I think it's of the many things I worry about, it's one of them, because people have suddenly, what if their self goes away, and then what's going on? They have no framework for that, right? And my guess is we used to lock those people up because we thought they were having some kind of breakdown or something. So, this is where I think the science can actually be very interesting, is how can we start to talk about these phenomena outside of a religious context? And it doesn't have to be a Buddhist one either, right? I think this is kind of a Buddhist-heavy program, but there are a lot of other traditions that have these kind of experiences too. But as long as we're talking about it in a secular way, how do you start to even establish in a scientific way? And this is where I think the work of Shinzen Young is quite interesting. That the reality of these experiences, and then, okay, now what do I do with them once they've happened? It'll be interesting, right? And then that'll set a whole new bar for, human horizons, I think.
As always, we're at the point where we have time for one more question.
Hi. What I wanted to kind of ask about or talk about was the first question about why now. And I think it might be an age situation of being in my mid-60s and growing up in the 50s in a small farm where you were either a Christian and went to church every Sunday or you lied about it. And to then moving to San Francisco in the 60s, mid-60s, summer of love, and all of a sudden learning about all these social movements, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, the gay movement at that point before it got all the 25 names, and learning about all the political, social, revolutionary movements at the same time all over the world, in Mexico and all over Latin America, and then people from Asia coming here and teaching about Buddhism, and it was brand new, and all of a sudden women were saying, oh, we can do it too, and kind of taking over, and people from here in Europe going to Asia. And so I think these social movements that have been so revolutionary of young people who are now all Buddhist leaders in their mid-60s and were all a bunch of radicals way back then, and took on all this, people like Sharon and everybody and people my age. Mm-hmm. But also folks from the civil rights movement, have been so instrumental in the US. And so I feel like we've all learned so much from the liberation movements of civil rights and from gay folks and from the environmental movements. And so I think this is another deep revolutionary movement about how we can deeply know ourselves in ways that we didn't learn when we were young. We learned to be good people and, question lying and question injustice. So I think now the idea of the other big thing, why now, is that the gap between the rich and the poor is worse than it ever was. And, there's more injustice in terms of poverty than there has ever been in this country. And so I think there's this huge rise up, to find something deeper, truer, and more equitable and more fair. And that is nothing to do with productivity, although that matters too. So I just think to give some credence to all this movement and caring and interaction between ethnicities and religions and what does it all mean, it's really exciting, and I think people really do care. And I really appreciate your original statement about we don't have too much time to get off that, working together and caring and finding new ways. So I really appreciate all your work. But I just wanted to kind of bring it back to the people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Amishi, would you like to provide a closing reflection? We're at the magical hour, or did you have another response?
No. We do want to spend a little time to practice too, right?
Well, Sharon is going to do that after you do your closing reflection.
I think I'll
And then Sharon will close
You're giving
us
me a
with
hard
practice,
task.
dear.
Okay, no, happy to. Okay, so basically, the reason I wanted to do something, we all decided it might be good to kind of wrap this thing together, is because it's a big topic, and there's no way we're going to wrap it up. And I think, as part of the planning committee's thoughts on why we wanted to have this as a topic, is because it's important. And I think we're at a point in our field, in our efforts together, and I think ISCS is a great example of this, where there is a lot of promise. There's so much good stuff happening. It's thrilling, actually, to walk around and listen to talks, to see and experience people at all levels of their career path, of all different kinds of careers working together. So I think there is a lot of promise. And I think the perils are real. I think that there are considerations that we all need to think through regarding some practical questions of implementation, effectiveness, long-term effects. And we should just have this be part of our continual dialogue, I think, as a field. It sort of parallels our efforts to be considering and evaluating our efforts. So sort of my concluding comment would be, let's make sure in our movement forward that we apply our own mindfulness to our efforts, that we continue to observe all that we're doing and all that's coming up, and that we use our own discernment in making, one moment-by-moment decisions about how we're going to engage and how we're going to behave. And one thing I want to say that I think is absolutely the case that we need to be doing is that we need to be kind. And I say this as a kind of a radical statement to offer in a developing discipline, an academic discipline. Most academic disciplines is not on the radar, be kind. But if there's any hope, I think contemplative studies is one of those areas in which, by kind, I don't mean nice, right? I mean a heartfelt concern for ourselves and those we engage with. And I think that'll help us see our way through as we encounter both the promise and the perils. So I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation we can continue to have for many years to come.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Sharon.
Yes, thank you. If you want to just sit comfortably, it's going to be a brief meditation as ordered. Someone wants to go to bed. And you're all, no doubt, very tired. Most of you, anyway. So if you could sit comfortably. Those of you who were here when we opened, I invited everyone to find their intention for this time together and then to actually make it bigger. So let's sit for a few moments with that intention, whatever it was for you, and just rest with that. Call to mind the positive experiences you've had here, not in terms so much of content or detail, but the feeling in your body. When you questioned, when you learned, when you were kind to yourself, to someone else, whatever it was. You can just feel that fill you. And then feeling that energy, being in touch with it, offer it. You can offer it to those who've helped you. now. Maybe someone's helped you be here right now, or in the past, who's inspired you, who's moved you. That joy we have in being together, the comfort, the risks we're willing to take to understand. You can feel all of that and offer it to those whom you know are hurting, are struggling, are afraid right now. And then to one another as we are completely co-creating this experience. And then all beings everywhere, all people, all creatures, all those in existence, no one left out. So thank you. Good night. May you rest well. And we'll see you in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you.